problems.
Thank you.
Thank you. Blake Stephenson.
Thank you, Chair. I have a few questions on planning and flood risk, if I can, Mr. In mid-Bedfordshire, we've seen houses in the village of Malden be reclassified as being in floodplain following significant development upslope from them. I think that's something that people have experienced across the country. Does the Environment Agency believe the current planning framework does enough to prevent inappropriate development in flood-prone areas?
Thank you, Mr. Stephenson. I've asked for some information about your constituency in particular. We are not aware of construction in the functional floodplain in your constituency, but if you have any evidence of that, we would look at it. It may be to do with surface water runoff in the case you're describing. There's also no main river in your constituency, so we're not actually the relevant risk management authority. It would be the local lead flood authority. More generally, we can see examples in Bedfordshire and Cambridgeshire of construction taking place in what we would call flood zone 3, which would be floodplain. We have generally managed to negotiate mitigations for that, but that requires you to raise the properties above the floodplain so they don't flood during a flood, and that is it's an expensive thing to do. It might be the right thing to do, but fortunately we have actually been successful in those, and we're confident that hasn't increased the flood risk to other properties through our flood risk assessment process. I said last Monday, Mr. Stephenson, in general, we have a good track record of getting our views heard by local planning authorities. There were just over 50 cases in the first quarter of this year where that wasn't the case. 40 of those are ones where the construction went ahead against our advice. 11 of them were cases where construction went ahead, but we had asked for conditions, particularly things like evacuation plans, that were not put in the planning advice. And I think that is a worry, because we have seen, the impact on and risk to life of not having adequate plans if you're living in a home which is very much at risk of flooding.
Thank you. And this second question, I think it actually follows on from the questioning by Mr. Thomas. And I think I noted here you'd said you have a degree of hard influence, but you use it sparingly. Mm-hmm. How often, and I think you may have answered this a little bit, but maybe unpick it a bit. How often is the Environment Agency's advice on flood risk overruled by planning authorities? Would the agency support stronger powers, such as a statutory right of a veto, when you see that there is a specific risk from flooding and the planning authorities are just continuing to approve development?
I think overwhelmingly we are listened to, and even when we raise it, so to give you some numbers, if that is helpful. So in the period between calendar year 16-17 and 23-24, there were 2,649 properties constructed in England against the advice of the Environment Agency. And in the year 23-24, there were 89 homes constructed against our advice. That is quite a small proportion of the overall level of homes. On the roughly 10,000 applications on which we would comment a year, last year we had 234 objections where we were concerned about the application, but we reached a resolution with the local planning authority. So that's the side of the system working. We raise objections, we are concerned, and we are generally listened to. And we were only left with 51 applications in the last quarter which were not satisfactorily resolved. So I think it does happen. Yeah. It doesn't happen at a huge scale. There is just a little nuance of complexity I think we have to be aware of.
Ask a follow-up. So those, we may talk about a small proportion, so just 51 applications, but these are people's homes, these are people's lives. People will move into these homes, and it's reasonably foreseeable from your analysis that they'll be flooded. So in those cases, would you like the agency to have some sort of veto so that it is resolved and people don't move into homes knowing that there's a high risk of flooding?
I think you've got to respect the role of the planning authority as the ultimate decision maker. What I was going to come on to say is there can be justifications for this. For example, that the use of the property might be not as a permanent residence. It could be there are flood defences planned which we are not aware of and can't take into account. It could be that there is a very important overriding public imperative for that development to go ahead. So I think it would be a bit peremptory for us to say you could never build against our advice. Clearly a planning authority takes a risk if they go ahead against our advice, and that risk is on them. They are the stewards of their community, not the Environment Agency. and it doesn't happen particularly often. But I would be nervous about undermining the democratic legitimacy of a local planning authority. I think that's an important principle.
I totally understand that. My final question, Chair, I know we're under pressure for time. You talked about negotiating conditions for certain applications. I think one of the concerns certainly my residents have is that conditions in planning applications are often not followed up. So do you see that there's a role for the Environment Agency to make sure that these conditions are actually built out when permission is given, houses are built? Do you see that as your responsibility to protect those houses, to make sure those conditions have been built out?
I think many of my colleagues at the agency would very much share your concern about developers promising one thing and not delivering anything they promised.
Right.
We very much welcome the strengthening of coverage of sustainable urban drainage in the latest iteration of the National Planning Policy Framework. We would wish to see the SUDS obligation that was in the 2010 Flood and Management Act commence, Section 3, that hasn't been commenced yet. And we're really worried about things like water consumption standards being met and making sure they're met before we, for example, release water credits. So I think you are making a very valid point there. Enforcement of broad brush planning restrictions can be difficult, and difficult for authorities as well, particularly when you're living in an area that's extremely high flood risk, and we have things like, I can give examples, where we insist there are no bedrooms on the ground floor, for example, and is that being consistently applied? That I think is a broader issue about the building control regime, whether that is actually working currently, rather than for us, but you are right, there is a risk of developers not living or abiding by the conditions we set.
Thank you, Mr.